Welcome to our chat about skirmish games and role-playing games. Is there a bright line between the two? Tonight I'm being joined by Shocktop, who is going to discuss this with me. Both of us are longtime wargamers. I've been at it since 2. Started with Rogue Trader and I want to say 3rd or 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. And I've played lots and lots of other war games since then. Shocktop, why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, I'm Shocktop. I run the Flooded Realms Substack. I've been a long-time RPG player, starting, a long time for me, back in 2014 with 5e before moving over to OSR stuff. I'm definitely less experienced on the war game front than you are there, Druid. I mostly play the odd historical here or there, and some of the more niche war games or skirmish games like Gaslands is a big favorite of mine.
I have not played that one yet.
Yeah, man, it's great.
It looks fun.
It is the most fun you can have with Hot Wheels after the age of 10.
Well, I don't know. I was big into Car Wars in high school, and that we had a blast with that guy. We played Car Wars all the time.
Yeah, it's inspired by Car Wars.
Yes.
And Dark Future, which is it's the GW one.
Right. I listened to Rule of Carnage, their podcast, video cast, whatever. A lot of those, especially the game design ones in particular, and I really enjoyed their discussions about how Gaslands came about. And to be quite honest, we used to run Car Wars campaigns, and we had persistent characters and persistent cars. And again, I want to say that these little skirmish war game kind of things are super, super close to being role-playing games. I honestly don't know that we're gonna dive into this as we go along tonight. We've got some questions. The Discord that were prompted. I really should have done a poll on Twitter. That didn't occur to me until just now.
Well, you could post it now, and we may be here a while. You may get some answers before
the end. We might. You know what? Let's do it. I'm going to post it right now.
Get some live feedback.
The primary question is there a bright line of division between a skirmish war game and a tabletop role-playing game? I don't think there is, and you do. So how should we start? The second question I had posed was, could a campaign-driven skirmish game such as Necromunda or Mordheim, Frostgrave, 5 Leagues from the Borderlands, could one of those be considered a tabletop RPG? And is there an unwritten lexicon or a written lexicon or practice for RPGs that differentiate them from skirmish scale war games? I think that games as developed as Necromunda, Mordheim, Frostgrave, 5 Leagues, all of those, I believe, could very easily be considered tabletop RPGs, because you can, as a player, control a single character and their henchmen, and you can go on sandbox-style adventures. You can interact with NPCs. You can go in combat with other players or the referee, or bots. You can advance. You can gain experience and improve your character. And with the inclusion of a referee, which isn't always necessary for G or a skirmish game, you can do things that may or may not be covered in the rule, but the referee can go ahead and make based on existing rules and the setting and the genre. And I think the same could be said with your basic games, something like Dungeons and Dragons, Witchery. I believe so. So I believe that there is not a bright line. There may be a distinction without a difference, but I don't think there's a bright line between them. I think that all of those things are parts of role-playing games that skirmish level war games with a campaign structure fulfill.
Okay. Well, I definitely have to disagree on a couple points there. To the first question with is there a bright line between a skirmish game and an RPG? I think yes. It's in breadth versus depth. Skirmish games are very, very in depth for what they want to do. You want to be resolving individual battles, even in the context of a campaign. You're not gonna ever say to your buddies, "Hey, let's do a session of Necromunda," and everybody show up, and then you don't do a gang versus gang battle. That's not gonna happen. As compared to D&D, where you say, "Hey guys, let's get together for a session of D&D." You don't really know necessarily what's going to happen, even in the context of an overarching campaign. You don't know what the individual sessions are going to be, and that's because RPGs are designed to give a much wider range of possible activities in a world than a skirmish game. So when you start trying to consider something like Necromunda as a RPG, you have to consider how does it handle player actions that aren't related to doing these battles between gangs. So you said, for example, that you can do a sandbox adventure in Necromunda. I'm reading the rules for it, and I don't see how you could necessarily do that, because there's no part of Necromunda where you navigate to wherever you're going. You're not in control of what battles are planned for the campaign. That's what whoever's running the campaign league does. It's not really a sandbox adventure. It is a series of battles that you then post hoc narratively justify, if that makes any sense.
It does. It does.
So
Carry on.
So when you're in a Necromunda campaign, I'm reading the campaign rules from this PDF that I have, which is, if I can see which version of the game, maybe looks like the 2003 printing. So maybe not the first one. A campaign, you start by just getting 2 or more players together and rolling up gangs, and then you just kind of go through this endless territory war between each other. And in the original campaign rules, which they changed, I was reading some history on Necromunda versions. They replaced these with the Dominion battle system, which is a fixed length campaign. So you have a set number of battles in a campaign, and then it's done, and you determine a winner. But with this, if a gang advances too much, they're just retired, and because nobody's going to want to play the game anymore with a gang that's just stomping everybody else and winning every single engagement. That's not really a state that you have in RPGs. In like your standard party-based RPG, you're never going to be mad that your fighter is simple and is just stomping every single encounter you get into. You're not going to be like, "Oh, you're sorry, you're playing the RPG too well. You're too good at it for you to keep playing this character." Whereas that is a state that you can get to in Necromunda. I play a lot of Blood Bowl, which has some similar advancement mechanics as Necromunda, which is another thing I want to bring up. In Necromunda, you advance your gang no matter what happens in a given session. Even if you completely lose a scenario, you just get absolutely wiped. You gain a little bit of experience on at least one of your guys. That's also not something that really happens in RPGs. And the reason it doesn't happen in RPGs is because RPGs are about rewarding mechanically your choices and punishing your mistakes, whereas this skirmish game is more about doing the specific skirmishes, and advancing in between them is just kind of you advance faster for being better at the game. The point is the skirmishes, not whatever you're doing in the world. So like all your NPC interactions too are very, very abstract. When you go to your trading post, it's just a series of rolls to see what's available for that week, and then you just give your gold over. It's not like you're haggling with a shopkeeper like you would be in an RPG, because you're not really playing a role. You are lightly justifying how you're purchasing whatever equipment for your gang. It's a completely different game feel.
Now, but that being said, is there a reason, mechanically or otherwise, that you couldn't haggle with the referee as a player, or say, go to the trading post as your character, and say, trade one kind of loot?
Well, I mean, mechanically, the reason is you can't do that. That's not allowed in the rules. The rules say if you have old weapons or whatever that you want to turn in, you get half their value in credits back. There's no haggling. It's just that's what you get, and you're done. You're not allowed to even ask for, like in Necromunda, when you go to the trading post, there are equipment that's considered rare, and you can't just go ask about every single rare item. Your league arbitrator just rolls in between sessions for how many items you have available and what they are. You don't haggle, it just is what it is, according to the rules. Now, your league arbitrator could ignore those. That's true, but then we're going to get into, well, how much do you want to ignore the rules that are in the game that you're playing when you're playing what is clearly meant to be set up as a competitive game amongst other people?
Okay. Well, here on scenario 2 on page 70, it says the deep underhive is a maze of ancient and abandoned ruins, concealed entrances, and long forgotten domes. Sometimes these contain priceless archaeotech, gems, precious mutant fungi, and other valuable items which can be scavenged from the depths.
Mhm.
Treasure hunting is not without risk, though, and these isolated places can be home to ferocious mutant creatures. In this scenario, scavengers, two gangs encounter each other while scavenging, and each tries to drive the other off and grab the loot for itself.
Right.
Each loot counter is worth 1d6 times 5 credits. So the loot is abstracted.
Yeah. And you do get XP for loot in this.
Correct.
But if you'll notice, it's 1 XP per loot counter. You're getting way more experience from just surviving on average, since you get a D6 XP for every fighter who survives. And if you win, your gang leader gets an extra 10, and wounds are 5. So if it is an RPG, the role that it wants you to play is not a scared looter. It's a person who's fighting and happens to pick up loot occasionally, because that's what it's choosing to mechanically reward. It's like one of the questions I had posed is whether or not a game that allows you to internally role play is enough to justify calling it a role playing game. I'll bring back Blood Bowl. You can absolutely, in Blood Bowl, for whatever reason, decide to take a team of just linemen. It would be extremely suboptimal, but you could do it if you're just role playing a coach that wants to do that for whatever reason. But I don't know that that necessarily means that it's a role playing game, because if we extend that logic out, then Call of Duty is a role playing game because I can choose themed loadouts, which doesn't seem like something that tracks.
See, I don't think that Blood Bowl would. I don't think it has the components that are necessary and sufficient to make that into a role-playing game, because Blood Bowl, the rules are specific to only playing the Blood Bowl game. There aren't rules for doing other stuff.
There really aren't rules for doing other stuff in Necromunda, though. like, I would argue that Blood Bowl has as much player advancement as and external stuff as Necromunda does, because you still have a market for players.
Well, right here it says that if a player wishes, he can use a ganger to search around the trading post and make inquiries about further rare items which might be for sale. A ganger who does this cannot collect income from the gang's territory that turn. Searching out rare items is an alternative to collecting income. For each ganger employed in this fashion, you may add a further +1 randomly generated rare item to the list of those offered for sale. So typically D3 items are offered automatically and a further +1 for each ganger sent to search them out. So theoretically, we could define the loot counter as one of the items listed in that scenario on page 70. Because I mean they are listed as types of items that you can find, mutant fungi, all right? And while rare trade chart, let's see here. Fungus is not something. Is it fungus on the list here?
The item chart, I don't think so. Let me see, because most of the items are specific stuff that you're going to use in battles.
Right.
Because the entire skirmish, the entire apparatus of the skirmish game is to support battles. There is
Correct.
stuff outside of it, but you're there to fight the battles. That's what you're doing. You could never, while playing.
It also says in the very first scenario at the beginning, gangs run the risk of encountering rivals as they explore the ruined Underhive landscape. So that's something gangs can do, is just explore. They can just explore. And then it says, not all encounters end in violence. Sometimes two gangs meet and, finding no good reason to fight, go their own way. So theoretically, your players could show up and they could choose to play Jim's Goliath gang this week, and they go down to do some scavenging, and they run into another gang and they say, hey, we found some fungus, you want some fungus? And they're like, yeah, we want some fungus. Do you want some some gems or whatever?
I mean, but that doesn't work because the loot counters aren't objects that persist after the scenario is done. They're just immediately mitigated into credits and experience. And the texture reading for scenario 1 is italicized, meaning that it's flavor text. So yeah, they are abstractly exploring when your league arbitrator sets up the matches for the week. But once the match is set up and the scenario is picked, that's what you're going to do. No one would like it if two people showed up and they just said, you know what, we don't want to actually play Necromunda this week. We're just going to call off the engagement and we'll just take our D6 experience and all our fighters. There's no winner. See you next week. Territories don't change hands. The only explicit mention in the rules that I found of players directly interacting with each other is on captured fighters. On the injuries, serious injuries section in campaigns, which is page 84 for the copy that I have.
Is that in the rule book or the source book?
The rule book, I believe. Yeah, I have a PDF of the rule book. I don't know if it's the same version that you have. I think this is the 2003 printing.
When did I get this? This is right, 1995.
Yeah, so I got a little different printing.
Yeah, so this is definitely first printing, first edition.
Yeah. But if you
it's
find,
funny because in yours you say that your text is italicized, and this one it's.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, it is. It is italicized in the scenario. It looks like what we would call box text or flavor text to me.
Gotcha. Yeah. See, here it's not. Here it's just text. That's funny.
Okay.
That's interesting.
And again, this is a scenario for a fight. This is just obviously your straightforward skirmish with no complicating factors. This is team deathmatch. The game has no specific objective than to drive off the enemy gang.
So-
You end by forcing them to either your opponent concedes or you force them to surrender, which I guess is called out in this.
Right.
With whatever the morale system is. But if I go back to is captured listed in the injuries table in that printing? Because that is the only mention I've seen of players directly interacting with players, as opposed to everything going through this abstract arbitrated system.
Yeah, in the post-battle sequence, which is on page 82 in my book, you roll a d66.
Yep.
And 61 to 63 is captured.
Yep, that's what this has as well.
And that's for a fighter who has gone out of action.
Mm-hmm. Which is being, downed in the actual skirmish.
Well, going out of action means that he can't down where you may have a serious injury recover without further effect. So
I see it on a.
Now down, if you are down and you don't make your recovery roll,
then you're out of
action, and then you roll on the serious injuries chart. So theoretically, fighter could be more than one figure could be captured.
Mm-hmm. So then you can go through this ransom procedure, which is again very proceduralized. You have to first exchange on a 1-for-1 basis, starting with the highest value models. And then, if there's any left, the player whose they are has a chance to pay the ransom. And that's the only time the other player can give any input, which they can choose an amount. There's no fixed amount. They just have to say, hey, I want this many credits. Or I want a territory, I suppose, since there's no fixed value. That is, as far as I can tell, the only time that players, by the rules that are in the rule book, are allowed to do this sort of outside of direct combat wheeling and dealing. Whereas, obviously, in an RPG with multiple players, they could do that at all times. It's kind of an expected thing for them to be doing.
All right, so that's an interesting interpretation, because the way I see capture says there's no fixed value for ransom. It's a matter for players to decide. For fighters who are not exchanged or ransomed may be sold to the guilders as slaves, earning their capture d6 times 5 credits. If captives are sold, their weaponry and equipment may be kept by the captors and then redistributed amongst their own gang. Now, it's interesting that this describes how to handle captives, but I don't believe that there are any rules that say that players are not allowed to negotiate between battles or negotiate between gangs in a downtime style, and put that in scare quotes, downtime type environment. And if you were doing, say for instance, if you were doing weekly turns and you had a weekly session, and each session is on a Saturday, and the session lasts, say, one day while you're doing, I don't know that there are any rules that say you can't negotiate with other things. I mean, you certainly, or gang members are not allowed to work your territory. You're looking for rare items. There's time activity. Working your territory for income is a downtime activity. So there's definitely a downtime concept within the game. So I guess what I'm saying is I think you could approach a game as detailed and structured the way that Necro, and you could certainly treat it the way we treat other role-playing games, and still maintain the mechanics.
So it specifically says in selling and during the trading post explanation that weaponry and equipment cannot be swapped between gangs. You're also not allowed to buy rare goods that are offered to other players. So even if you're rolling all of those where everybody can see them, you're not allowed to interact with somebody else's rare goods. This is page 97 for me, second page of the trading post rules.
That's interesting, because I'm under trading post. That's on page 54 in my version.
It's after the trade chart under the selling heading for me. Last paragraph. Alternatively, old weaponry can be hoarded for future use, make a note on the gang roster, or it can be swapped around the gang from one fighter to another, although not between gangs. So if you're arguing for this sort of freewheeling and dealing of items and that sort of stuff between players, that
Here we
would
go.
be
Okay.
between gangs.
Huh. Why would it say that? Not between gangs. That's interesting.
Because the intent is for players to be fighting players in skirmishes. And if you allow people to do that, you're going to run the Kingmaker risk like you have in Catan. And I don't think GW wanted that. They didn't want somebody to be like, oh, I'm just going to give you a bunch of weapons for free because you've
So
joined this league late.
here's definitely a spot that prevents this would be a mechanic that if you were playing this raw, that would prevent that sort of player communication, player interaction from one gang to another.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting.
Yeah. And I would argue that it's because the intent of a skirmish game is not to fully allow the breadth of gameplay that an RPG would allow. Because if you allow that while also having, I mean, look at how long the combat rules are in this. This is longer than some published RPGs just to fight what should be in an RPG would be like a 2 or 3 round battle in a dungeon somewhere. But that's because ultimately skirmish games are not trying to deliver the same sort of experience that an RPG is.
Fair enough.
Now, what I do think you could do personally, because I am of the opinion, like you are the prime D&D is a war game guy. That is that is what I think you were most known for. And of course, my counter is always D&D contains a war game. I think you could very well use the Necromunda skirmish rules as the war game piece of an ongoing homebrewed RPG. But you would clearly be outside the parameters of Necromunda in and of itself. And you were doing something greater.
I think you could do something larger with this, and it wouldn't take much. I don't think it would take hardly any homebrewing. It would take a little bit of drawing a line through a couple of little rules like this one here, the not between gangs.
Mm-hmm.
Changing the idea of the loot that you collect is not persistent, because the loot you gather is abstracted. But the referee could define the loot, and then you could hoard the loot just like you can hoard weaponry.
Yeah.
And again, that you are correct. I will give you that. It is not rules as written, but it is a very small change. So for what I'm getting at is, and what had been discussed on the Clerics Wear Ringmail's Discord server overnight one night, while this may not be a TTRPG, if you were to
you cut out.
Being it, but I don't think that it is a big project to approach the game as an RPG.
Oh.
And I especially think that if you played it in one-to-one time style where you have one-to-one pacing and your gangs go on adventures, and maybe there's just one gang versus the referees' gangs, an adventure that extends for multiple days, and then the next time you get together, if you were playing in a West Marches style, for instance, this week we get together and we play your gang, and I play one. The other guy, all us guys play a character within your, and we go on an adventure a couple weeks, on a scavenger hunt or whatever down in, and then next week those characters are unavailable because of the mission, and we're doing 1-1 pacing. Then this week we play my gang, and you have a character within my gang. We go off and do something else, so forth. So you could easily rotate through, and next week your gang might be available, who has captured one of his. So I think you could very easily do it with very small changes.
I hear what you're saying, but I think when you start saying, "Oh, we're gonna just play characters in each other's gangs," you're getting way off the reservation for Necromunda, the actual combat as written. Because what do you mean by a character? We're all going to be fighters? Do people have to bite the bullet and play Jubes? Does that mean that the main gang leader no longer gets to control those dudes in combat? And even if you are playing against your referees gangs, you have the other complication that Necromunda doesn't have true hidden information when you're actually at the tabletop fighting a skirmish. Everyone can see what everyone's dudes can do. Everyone knows what the stratagem cards do. It's all out there because the point is a competitive skirmish experience between two players who are playing a full gang, as opposed to D&D, or an RPG, which is an asymmetric experience of a very different sort.
Yeah, see, I don't think it's that different. I wouldn't say that it's very different. I would say it's a little bit different. And I think let's go ahead and bring in one of the comments that we got on the Discord earlier.
Okay.
Brigadine said the difference is the mindset of the typical players and the breadth of potential action of each.
Mm-hmm.
Which breadth of action is exactly what you were getting at. Have you ever played Ars Magica?
I have not, but I'm aware of the rules.
Okay, so Ars Magica is literally just like that, where each player controls, a magic user or whatever, and they have a party of henchmen, and take turns playing entourage.
You've broken up.
Oh, sorry. The premise is that each player has a magic user or a wizard, and you take turns playing henchmen within each other's wizard's entourage.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which I think would be a similar approach that you could take this game. And I think what would be a reference document that would need to be written to describe approach and how to approach the game and how to approach the play your each character.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's nothing that says that I can't start a gang and then everyone else that's in the group would be a Jew, and they would develop through organic play, and we just take turns playing Jews in each other's gangs until we to fighters or gangers or whatever as we move up the experience pole.
Yeah.
Ladder.
I mean, You could do that. My argument is less that is an impossible mode of play, and more that the rules, you're going to be fighting against the rules the entire way up. The thing about Ars Magica is, as you said, there are references to how you're supposed to play each of the various henchmen, because you have different kinds of henchmen, right? In Ars Magica,
Yes.
like you have your Igor type henchman who does things. You've got like an apprentice magic user and that sort of stuff, and there are rules as to what you're supposed to do. Necromunda doesn't have that because it's supposed to be I have my gang. I am playing against another player who also has a gang, and we're moving pieces on a game board. I would be very upset if I have to now deal with my buddy who's decided, you know what, you rolled bad when in our battle last week, so I'm just going to intentionally suicide your gang champion. And I admit, there is a level of don't play this with people who are going to act like that. But why even try to make the game work that way when there are already sci-fi RPGs that are designed to have people in a group who may not necessarily agree and may not necessarily, but you're not getting screwed out of potential development of your own gang if you're doing that.
That's a completely different question. If you're, that's an excellent question. If you're looking to play a specific kind of game, why would you grab something and play something else?
Yeah.
Which is an excellent question. But that wasn't what the OP had mentioned. They were looking for science fiction grimdark games. You could do it with this, and that started a whole firestorm. But
yeah. I mean, my point is that you want to do grimdark dungeon crawling in sci-fi. I don't personally think that Necromunda is a very good vehicle for that. Because you're right, you could have everybody, let's make a gang, and let's the ref is going to set up dungeons for us each week in scenarios, and we're going to be against referee controlled gangs. But that is such a completely different play style than what Necromunda is trying to do. And the argument is it an RPG? And the answer is no. But yeah, I can use my wrench like a hammer if I want to.
Correct.
I think maybe my point is, yeah, you can misuse Necromunda to be an RPG. That would be what I would say. But you are, in fact, misusing it. It is not an RPG.
So then would you be willing to go so far as to say that there is a distinction between a skirmish war game and a tabletop RPG?
Yes.
But there's not necessarily a bright line where you can say this cannot be used as an...
I mean, that's saying something cannot be used ever.
Like, I don't think you could have a full-blown RPG with Blood Bowl.
I mean, why not?
I think you could make... because there aren't any rules for everything that happens off the field.
Yeah, there are. I mean, there are rules for your players getting hurt. There are rules for recruiting new players and selling players. And there are rules for getting sponsorships and losing them. There's rules for mismanaging your team's funds. There's all kind of rules for stuff that happens in off-field in Blood Bowl. Again, I would argue that a Blood Bowl team does the same amount of off-direct field stuff as a Necromunda gang does for its off-table development. It's just different because you're playing fantasy football. You're not doing gang wars.
Right.
So, I mean, if you wanted to say, we want to run this Blood Bowl league, but instead of doing it, we're going to have everybody's going to play a positional in a Blood Bowl team, and you get to move when it's your turn, and you get to do your own play. And instead of having set matches, you're an exhibition team who has a map, and we're doing a war game, a map-based war game campaign. You get to decide where you go to play each week, and then the referee is going to run a team that's based off of that. That's basically what you're describing with Necromunda. But I think you would agree that you've changed Blood Bowl completely from what it is. But I would say, well, you've made a fantasy football RPG now. That's kind of what I'm driving at. There is a bright line between them, and just because you can mangle it into the shape that you want your RPG to be in doesn't mean it is one. Again, you can use things however you want to use them if you're willing to put in the effort. But the amount of effort you're going to have to put in is staggering. And secondarily, clearly, skirmish war games or war games in general can be used to be RPGs because that's where RPGs come from. So,
Right. See, and I think that's our biggest disagreement is the amount of work needed. I think the amount of Necromunda or even Frostgrave for that matter in an RPG is not staggering. I think minimal.
Well, I think the problem you're going to immediately run into, where the work is going to show itself, because you've argued everybody's going to be a gang member, and we're going to do 1-to-1 pacing, and we're going to just have them go on various adventures. What are you going to do when one of the adventures that the group wants to do that week is not just a scenario you can play Necromunda for? Like, you go look at the scenarios, there's only a couple setups that really work. So what do you do when they say, you know what, we don't want to do anything with gangers, we don't want to mess with that, we don't want to do a gang engagement, we're going to go up to the top level space docks and we're going to kick in the mayor of Necromunda and we're going to steal a spaceship and go into the warp. That's what we want to do. What scenario are you going to play for that? And then what are you going to do if they actually get into the warp? An RPG can answer that question. Necromunda can't. Not without a serious lift.
In that case, then you're correct, because the game master the referee would need to then create the NPCs needed for the guards at the starport or the mechanics. And I will that Necromunda is not including statistics for NPCs in general, or how to just create a basic person or a guard.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I do know that there are supplements for what are the police called?
The Palatines. There's a book called Law and
the ones that the Judge Dredd kind of looking guys,
Yeah.
There is a supplement for that.
Mm-hmm.
So part of that has been addressed in a supplement. I also go out and fight orcs. So that's, and then you start getting into, but again, that's the kind of work, kind of creativity that the game master or referee, if players decide to do something, still going to have to come up with people. And it's not, I wouldn't call it a staggering amount of work, because you can very base NPC structure, character structure, and figure structure, because all of the figures have a standard profile that can be modified to fit various things. And then you've got your bounty hunters, which can be modified, to make them into the police, that sort of thing. So I don't know that it's, again, I'm not saying this is a novice or a beginner, but this is something that an experienced, especially if someone is experienced with 40K.
Yeah.
Especially the older versions of 40K, because then they would have access to rules that are, if not designed to match, or at least congruent, or close enough for hand grenades, as the saying.
Yeah.
Where you say, I've got, the police are going to look like a soldier. I have an file there.
So
skill, that sort of thing. But yes,
you can.
I will say, I will go so far as to say there is definitely a between most of these skirmish games, but I would also say that, especially with some of them, would be very little that you more of, or even a full-fledged. Especially if you had people that were prepared to approach it as such. If you got together a group and said, "Hey, we're going to create a campaign, and we're going to use Necromunda rules and play a role." I think it could be done, and I think it could be pretty easy. Now, that being said, do I have time to prove it? No.
Yeah, and I think we've kind of wandered from the main point, which is, are skirmish war games RPGs? Can they be considered RPGs? Because now we're getting into, can you do this? Can you do that? Can you utilize this? Well, yes. When I first got into RPGs generally, I was very annoyed that there's never good black powder rules. And for years, I got off black powder guns as just being crossbows. They were just crossbows. Everything was a crossbow. It didn't matter what system I was using. If I wanted black powder, it's just a crossbow. It's D8. You rolled a hit like a normal missile weapon. And that worked. But is that really qualitatively what I wanted? You know what I mean? Are you qualitatively playing an RPG because you're saying, well, you want to go off and do the starport? Okay, well, we're gonna just say the starport guards, they behave like this gang. They're just reskinned. All right, well, you've got a warp-capable ship. Now you're in the warp fighting daemons. Well, we're just gonna use this gang, but it's daemons. Don't look at the stats. That's not important. It's still daemons. You're not really qualitatively changing anything about Necromunda at that point. And I think that's where RPGs shine for me, is they support a wide variety of qualitatively different gameplay that is connected to what you're doing in game. Like the domain game of D&D is very different from level 1 dungeon crawling, which is very different from your sort of mid-level half mass combat engagements, which is similarly different from going on a sailing adventure in D&D.
Because you know what? This does not include sailing rules.
Right.
And this does not include flying space. And this does not include any sort of rules for planets. And I mean, it has territories within the hive, but beyond that, it does not have rules for that.
Yeah, and that's another thing. Like, if you were approaching it as an RPG, and that means that your players are signaled, oh, this is an RPG, I can do, or at least attempt, literally anything that I can think of in this world. But the game can't really mechanically support it, and the referee is going to have to patch a lot of holes, if that makes any sense.
Yep.
There are a lot less holes to patch in D&D if you do your classic 3 hex start, 1 city, 1 dungeon, 1 wilderness hex. And the players just, instead of going to the dungeon, immediately march to the west until they find an ocean, and then they build a ship, and then they go sailing. There's a lot less danger of going off map in an RPG than there is in Necromunda or any skirmish game. And that's where I think the big bright line that tells me this is a skirmish game versus, or this is a campaign skirmish game versus this is an RPG is what does the game as the system itself is written without too much referee intervention allow for the players to do? Does it signal to them that literally anything they can think to do is possible? Or does it tell them, yeah, you can do stuff, but we're kind of just going to be fighting the same battles every week?
I think that's an excellent conclusion.
Yeah.
You've won me over.
Oh man, I didn't expect that. I really wasn't trying to win anybody over. Well, at least not you.
No. It's no. Hey, this is why we have these kinds of conversations. The RPG has a broader range of possible session activity, and the rules are included to.
Oop, you cut out there.
No, I stopped. I'm trying to.
Okay.
I'm trying to type a sentence here. The RPG rules as written contains the mechanics needed to allow player agency, covering a broader range of possible. All right, I like it.
Yeah.
So a campaign-driven skirmish game could be considered very. I don't even think limited is the right word.
Focused is the word I would use.
Focused. Because what an RPG sacrifices is depth on a lot of these mechanics. Like an RPG, D&D is not a sailing simulator. It has sailing rules, but it's not gonna. Anybody who's like, oh, I want to pretend I'm on like 100 crew galleon with 4 sails, they're not gonna get that. And the combat rules are far simpler than a true skirmish game or a war game. That is the sacrifice you're making. Is mechanical focus on something versus breadth of possible player action. Yeah, I like that.
Because I would never call Necromunda or any good skirmish game a limited game. I agree, that is not the right word to use. In the same way I wouldn't call a wrench a limited tool. It's a focused tool.
Right. A campaign-driven skirmish game, such as Necromunda, Mordheim, Frostgrave 5, can be considered a tightly focused RPG. That's the word I want to use here. Specific. Okay.
Yeah, that's when you're getting into very, very nitpicky definitions. But I would agree with you to that. Because you could, going back to Blood Bowl, you could consider Blood Bowl an extremely focused RPG where the role you're playing is a coach, obviously. And there's only so many things that you can do as a coach. But that does not mean Blood Bowl is an RPG in the broad definition, or a tabletop RPG.
I think we have answered the question.
Yeah, I think so too. That was good.
That was good. So hey, I appreciate your time, man. And thanks everybody for listening. Thanks Shop Top for participating and being an excellent debater and conversation, and bringing me over to your way of thinking.
Over to the dark side. Welcome to it. We're going to have you explaining that RPGs are actually engines, not games, before long.
That's a bridge too far today, but we'll see. We'll see what we can do. Thanks, everybody, and keep on gaming.